11 seconds remaining. One last rush perhaps for the Flyers. Giroux to Hartnell. To Giroux. Giroux holds all the way across. Parker scores! 2.1 seconds remaining, and the Flyers are on top.
SportsNetwork.com and Wildfire Radio present the O&B Puckcast, episode number 47, as the Flyers have hired Alain Vigneault to be their head coach. I'm here with my partner, Chef B. How are you, man?
Much better now. Much better.
Yeah. Back from sick bay. And, of course, Dan, the Flyer fan from Brotherly Puck. How are you, man?
Doing pretty good. I'm not nearly as negative as most people are right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, there was a big build-up with the anticipation that the Flyers had the inside on Coach Q. We know what happened there. He was never coming here. The Flyers, according to George Richards from The Athletic, outbid Florida, but they never had a chance because Q goes way back with Talon. Talon's the guy that hired him. And he probably's like, look, Coach Q, he's 60 years old. And Dan, I mean, he just probably, look, if it doesn't work out, he's got a retirement home.
Yeah, Bill Meltzer or something said, if they run out of cash, he can just, party there on the side and be there for his retirement. So I don't blame him one bit. It is what it is. I would want to be down there too. Florida has a lot of young talent right now, and I think what those guys need, what the Barkovs and Huberdeaus and Trocheks need, is somebody like him to, kind of steer them in the right direction and make them become a perennial playoff team, like I think they can really be.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chef, I mean, I don't want to bury the lead. We're going to have Dave Isaac on here directly, probably about 20 minutes or so. But I think Florida actually has a better roster than the Flyers. I think the Flyers have better players in waiting, but right now, if they get a goalie, I think the Panthers probably have more talent, especially up front.
Yeah, I mean, I covered them for the Flyers. They came in, I think, 2 or 3 of the games that actually went down and covered were Panthers, and they gave the Flyers all kinds of trouble. I mean, they do have a lot of great, fast, speedy forwards, and I think one of the games went to overtime, and they could just wreak havoc. They got some really good young players, and I think that Q's going to have himself a really good time. I think they're going to surprise everybody next year. That team needed a little bit of structure, and now they got it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, you think of guys like Dadonov, Barkov, Huberdeau, and Trocheck, who I think is one of the really great under-the-radar players in this league. And all they need really is, just like I talked about the goaltending, they need to return to form to the defenseman who was taken first overall. His name escapes me.
Aaron
Ekblad. And Matheson's a good player. They have Pizik down there. He's a good player, I think. I think they got the makings of a good team, so it's not a shock that combined with the Talon connection and the Florida location, that Q will be down in Sunrise.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Florida Panthers roster, and it's almost amazing that they missed the playoffs the past couple of years. They really have a really talented group, and most of them are really young. I think if they have somebody like Q and maybe a solid goaltender, whether they bring in somebody like Bobrovsky or Varlamov in the summer, that could be a really stacked team, and they could really cause some trouble in the East Conference.
Yeah, and don't overlook Jonathan Quick as a possibility for them as well. He had a bad year, but in front of the right team, he could have a comeback. He's still in, pretty good shape. He's got a kind of alter some things with his style, but he could be had for pretty cheap. So if Bobrovsky, tries to play games and wants a lot of money and all that, that's certainly another option that could be out there. And I'm still not ruling out the possibility of Quick to the Flyers, especially Chef. If in an interview with Stick to Hockey podcast, Fletcher said something that was rather odd. I don't know if you caught it. And we're going to ask Dave Isaac this, and we'll get your comments, but I definitely want to ask him about this. He wants not only one veteran backup for Carter Hart, and he definitely wants to have like a 50-30 split. He wants two. So it's almost like he wants a McKenna to work with Sandstrom in the AHL, even though McKenna is probably going to retire, but a guy like that, a guy who could be in the NHL, and then another player like Elliott, or I think it's going to be Talbot either way, but your thoughts?
Well, when you look at the last year, we tied and set the record for goalies played. He's probably just hedging his bets because you never know what to expect the last couple of years with this team and goalies. So I think it's actually a smart move. If you're going to if you keep hearing that that our farmed goalies are going to be making debuts in the AHL, whether it be Stamenko or
Sandstrom.
Sandstrom. It really, at this point, you kind of don't. You want to have a little bit of guidance. We don't want it to be the free for all that that it might have been in the past, where these goalies need a little bit more attention, maybe in that way. So I think it's a smart idea, actually.
Yeah, and Dan, I think the plan is Ustamenko in the ECHL, Sandstrom being the lead dog in the AHL with that veteran. I guess that deals out your favorite goaltender, Alex Lyon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Alex Lyon. I've been to quite a few Phantoms games over the back half of the season here, and, Alex Lyon is like a god down there with the Phantoms, but, amongst the fan base, but he's not very good. And I definitely don't think he's the guy that I would want, Sandstrom learning from. So, finding another, veteran kind of guy, another journeyman guy, I think maybe a little better than McKenna, who could maybe come up to the NHL if needed, if an injury happened. But, I think finding somebody to help Sandstrom kind of learn his way in North America could help greatly.
Yeah. Dan, do you think that Talbot is a bigger or a greater possibility now that Vigneault's been hired, because they had a relationship and he had a lot of success in New York as the backup for the Rangers?
I definitely think it improves his chances. I think he was probably going to come back anyway. The thing with the goalie market this year is it really sucks this summer. You got Bobrovsky and Varlamov, and then after that, there's just nothing there. A lot of guys that are, past their prime and getting older or just plain backups anymore. So I think Talbot and probably even Brian Elliott, those two are maybe two of the top free agents this summer. So I think that they probably keep Talbot at this point to, probably swing with Carter Hart. They're still friends, apparently, and now he's friends with the coach. So pays to know people, I guess.
Yeah. Look what happened in Florida. We just mentioned. Chef, I guess we got to go through this because part of an off-season preview is a quick review of what we just saw for 82 games. The Flyers finished 37-37-8 for 82 points. That's a 16-point decline from last season. It's clear to me, and you can comment, that a malaise has settled in. I think part of that was the lack of expectations and the inert nature of Ron Hextall's tenure as GM, as he was kind of waiting for go time. And the expectations really have not been that high since they last won a playoff series. I think this is a team that needs a facelift above and beyond the hiring of a high-profile coach like Vigneault.
Definitely. I don't know who you would consider safe or not safe at this point, if anybody's safe. But it does lead you to believe that, you made the point. They played for Gordon until they couldn't play anymore. I mean, they kind of had their playoff run when they were 28-2 or whatever, and they pushed through it. They pushed it, but here's a team that just wore out. And when they were out, or almost out, they kind of gave up a little bit. So, that's two coaches they gave up on this season. And, that's a culture thing. And I think you need to root out some of the bad seeds in the locker room. And I think it lends itself to two or three of them, to at least two. I mean, you're looking at least two or three spots in the forwards and the wingers that are able to be won or changed over the season. And then, at this point, you need to make a change to make a statement that this mediocrity and this the giving up on a coach is not acceptable anymore.
Yeah, I know, Dan, we had Johan Gartner on last time. He talked about adding and not wanting to subtract. And I hear that, and I can agree to some extent, but here's my thing. If you quote Chuck Fletcher, and I was on the O&B Puckcast the other night with Rob, Radio Rob, and thanks to those guys for having me on. And I just read this little bit of paragraph. I'll try and keep it brief, but I'm going to quote Chuck Fletcher. We have some bad habits right now. Flying the zone before we have possession of the puck, not getting in shooting lanes, not keeping the third guy high, turning pucks over in the neutral zone when there's no time and space to make a play, just recognizing things. It's mindset. But you need the mindset to embrace the habits. Close quote. Dan, to me, that screams like you have a cultural problem here, and just adding to the same excrement, if you can excuse that expression in describing players that way, that's not going to fundamentally solve the problems even with a guy like AV coming in.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a culture thing at this point, and shaking up the current core, not just necessarily adding a free agent, I think is what needs to be done. You're gonna, and I don't even bring this up on Twitter anymore because there are too many idiots these days. But moving people like somebody like a Jake Voracek or somebody like that to make a statement, you're kind of risk and reward factor there. Going back to maybe, a Mike Richards, Jeff Carter trade in the first place, somebody like that to kind of bring in a fresh set of teammates here for this team to work on and kind of cut some dead weight at the same time. It's just, the more important part of this summer anyway was player acquisition and, fixing the lineup and not necessarily coaching from the first point at all. So, yeah, they need to cut some weight here, and some of the more irresponsible guys, some of the more comfortable veteran forwards that have been here a long time, maybe need that extra kick in the butt to really turn this team around.
No, I agree. I think there's a problem there, and I'm going to bring this up again with Dave. We don't want to be too repetitive, but we just want to kind of set the stage for Dave to come in and comment on this stuff. But the Flyers were down 0-2 in 32 out of 82 games. I mean, you would expect that from a last-place club, not a team that, was a playoff contender until the last 10 games. I mean, obviously, there's something here that is systemic. So we'll have to see what happens in that regard. Chef, let's take the micro and the macro view. Now, the Flyers, they seem to be in trouble, not only from a league-wide perspective, becoming kind of irrelevant in the scale of what the NHL is and the teams that are up and coming, but also locally. When you consider the four major sports, the Flyers have sunk like a rock. They're practically irrelevant, and they might get 5 minutes, like maybe once a week, and that's now while they're still playing hockey.
Yeah. I remember doing a show 3 years ago, and they were asking, when we got, it looked like all the prospects were coming for tuition, and people were saying, who do you think's the next closest to win a championship? I mean, because I was on an all sports show then, and it was just like, well, and I said, if you look at all the prospects and how bright that future is for the Flyers, I would have to say Flyers, and it was 2 years. Probably more than that. Then it was 2 years before the Eagles won the Super Bowl, and now the Flyers, who were leading the pack, in my opinion, at that time, have flipped the switch, and they are total. They're at the bottom, and then they're 4 I mean, what could, unless they make huge moves in this offseason, they're 3-4 years away now.
Yeah. Dan, this is what happens when it's like prospects, and then you get into that thing that you've seen a lot of people on Twitter saying. I think it's undeniable now. You're always 2 or 3 years away from being 2 or 3 years away.
Yeah, that is that's the hole they've fallen in anymore. And it's just, unless they really have a good summer, and I mean like a real good summer, not necessarily just 1 or 2 players.
Heck yes.
It's not going to be this year, It's just things need to change, and it's now that they can finally kind of take that step forward without Ron Hextall holding them back. Now they may actually be 2 or 3 years away, versus the Ron Hextall theory of just keep adding until we can't add no more, But I think things may actually change this summer. I think Fletcher still has a lot in his plate. He has a lot to change here, and hopefully he can, make a couple big moves that get this team ready for the upcoming season, and maybe hurry this process up, and so it's just 1 or 2 years away instead of 10.
Yeah, no, I hear you, but we can all take comfort in knowing that, like Ron Hextall said, I wasn't going to trade a young player for a 34 or 35-year-old. I just wasn't going to do it. So, so we can take comfort in that. So before we hook up with Dave Isaac from the Courier Post, just to take a little comfort with Alain Vigneault. He has his critics, and like Bill Meltzer tweeted out. He also has 2 trips to the Stanley Cup Finals, with 2 different teams, an additional conference final appearance, 5 other seasons in which his team reached the second round of the playoffs, 8 regular seasons with 100-plus points, and a Jack Adams Trophy chef.
Got an impressive resume. And for all those people that out there that said, well, he didn't win a cup yet. Well, I put this to you. How many guys have won multiple cups? How many coaches with multiple teams? So I'm just saying, if he's been there twice and he has all those wins and all those 100-plus seasons, I'm going to say the guy, pretty much you keep shooting an arrow, you're going to hit the bullseye, or throw a dart, you're going to hit the bullseye one of these times. And I like the fact that, he hasn't done it yet. So maybe, he can do it with this team. He can make this team go to that beyond point.
Right. And Dan, I do think there is some reasonable criticism in terms of the Flyers didn't take a real long time for this process. So they apparently never considered guys like Sheldon Keefe and the new wave guys. It seems like the Flyers got the second banana-type coach, high-profile, proven coach, after Q, and kind of went with that because Chuck had a certain comfort level with him, and many people wanted this process to play out a little bit longer. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I've seen all kinds of hot takes about this over the last 24 hours or so, and I obviously, when you take Coach Q out of the equation, the talent level drops off drastically, right? He was kind of the golden carrot, and everybody else is just second to him. So it could have been worse. He could have brought in a Dan Bylsma or somebody like that, who would have been a freaking disaster. And I think at this point, bringing in somebody like Sheldon Keefe, who doesn't have any NHL experience, is just not going to happen. Dave Hextall is fresh in all of our minds still, and I think, the experimental phase is over. It's time to bring in somebody who has, some credit to his name. And I think Alain Vigneault does have his negatives, but so does everybody. I think it's up to him to come in and make his change. And I'm going to say the same thing I said when Scott Gordon was fired. I'm not going to really have an opinion on this guy yet, and I want to see what he does first before I form my opinion. I don't want to tear him apart for, what he did on a bad Rangers team or what he did on a good Vancouver team. I want to see what he can do with this group of guys. And, ask me this question again in 9 months, and I'll give you my real answer.
Yeah.
And true to Dan's point, I mean, you look back on one of his teams there, and he had Aaron Asham, Marty Baron, Dan Carcillo, Del Zotto, and Talbot. So a lot of throwaway Flyers in that team, and he managed still, I think, to get 100 points that season. So not too shabby.
Yeah, a lot
Aaron
of people.
Asham.
Yeah, Aaron Asham, just hanging around, I guess, at that point. But yeah, I mean, he did have a lot of guys like that. But a lot of people will say, well, he had Tortorella's bunch, and he kind of ran that into the ground. But I think Tortorella has a way of running his team down over many years, not only just physically from blocking a lot of shots and doing all that kind of stuff, but mentally. If you don't have a lot of turnover in the lineup, he can be a lot. Now, I think he has adjusted. He really stunk up the joint in Vancouver. I'm talking about Tortorella now. So, but, if he was the right guy, he came in, they go to the finals. And the thing is with the Flyers, if they had brought in a Laviolette or a Tortorella, I could deal with just adding to what they have. Because I think those guys would straighten guys like Voracek and Gostisbehere out. And whereas with AV can't be bothered with that. He's a player's coach. He tells you he's going to install structure. Biggest problem with the Flyers is their systems, their structure, their zone exits have been horrible, no consistency. And I think we're going to see a lot of that improve. But he's not the kind of guy who's going to babysit players, and he's not going to be the hard guy. So that's why, hearkening back to our discussion about getting somebody, getting some different personnel here, I think it's really important and certainly a subject that we will broach with Dave Isaac to join us momentarily. Okay, we are on, after a little bit of audio trouble there, with the preeminent Flyers a beat writer back on the O&B Puckcast for the second time. From the Courier Post of South Jersey, let's welcome on Dave Isaac. Dave, thanks for coming on the O&B Puckcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem. Sorry, but we had some technical problems there. And, hey, no reason to bury the lead here, as the Flyers have hired Alain Vigneault as the 21st coach in team history. Two-part question. Your thoughts about the process and the hire itself. And in your mind, was this the biggest coaching hire, perhaps, since they brought in Peter Laviolette?
Well, certainly the biggest name since Peter Laviolette. In terms of the process that this all went through, that goes back several months. Back in December when the Flyers decided they were going to move on from Dave Haxtell, they thought they had a deal with Joel Quenneville, who, as we now know, is with the Florida Panthers. And I reported at the time that it was a done deal. That was what I had been told from sources, and that ended up not being the case. That deal fell through, but the Flyers still wanted to keep trying. And you've seen reports this week from a couple of people. Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet, he reported that the Flyers actually had a face-to-face meeting with Quenneville earlier this month. And like I said, that he was their, the guy that they were going after. And George Richards of The Athletic, who was all over this story from the Panthers side of things, said that even then the Flyers, after that meeting, threw more money at him than even the Panthers were going to pay him or will pay him now. And he still decided to go to Florida. So clearly his heart was set on South Florida, that Fort Lauderdale area, where Shane Gostisbehere is from, that kind of region there. So the Flyers had to, move to Plan B, and Alain Vigneault quickly became their Plan B. Chuck Fletcher talked yesterday about how he kind of knew Vigneault from afar and admired his work, but it didn't sound like they had spoken much because just judging by what he said yesterday, he said that he had gotten to know him the past couple of days. So I don't know how many times they had actually spoken before this coaching search in Philadelphia began, but he is now the guy. And yeah, he's a big name, but I think that part of the Flyers going for Quenneville was they thought that was a very marketable name. I don't know that. I think that Quenneville's in a class by himself there. The 3 Stanley Cup rings that he has, nobody else coaching in the league has that. And that's not something you can really sell to fans when you get outside of that tier, I think. So Vigneault, he may do a very good job, but I don't think he's going to be a grand marketing scheme kind of guy that the Flyers are hoping for. And honestly, they need a big summer. They know it. Fans have been asking for it. They need to have a big summer, and it can't just be getting a new coach again.
Yeah, I agree. We were talking earlier before you came on about the type of coach that Vigneault is. He's not a babysitter. He's not going to be the kind of guy who maybe like Laviolette or a Tortorella would get in guys' faces, and you could kind of roll back with the same group and maybe add to that. I think because of the nature of the way Vigneault is, his personality, he doesn't seem to be the guy who has time for that. So I think the Flyers are going to have to remake their team a little bit culturally, especially when reading some of your articles on the in a Courier Post, all the things that Chuck Fletcher said in his exit interview about mindset and habits. And, this is a team that was down 0-2 in 32 out of 82 games. So obviously it seems like there's a systemic problem here.
And like you said, that's something that Chuck Fletcher mentioned time and again in the exit interviews was bad habits and mindset. And it goes back to training camp, which when he mentions training camp, that's almost an indictment of Dave Haxtell again. But, you had Scott Gordon in there for, 3.5 months, 3 months?
Yeah.
And he couldn't fix it either. So, a lot of these coaches have different styles. Haxtell was, even though he was brought in to be, a guy that grooms these young prospects, he wasn't a great communicator. A lot of the players didn't know where they stood with him. And with Scott Gordon, the players may not have always loved the message, but Gordon was very clear with them about what he expected, what he was looking for from them. Vigneault, I believe, is somewhat similar in that regard, where he's been called a player's coach just because he is so communicative, but I don't think those two things necessarily mean the same thing, So, it'll be interesting to see what he does with this group. Again, Chuck Fletcher mentioned yesterday Vigneault's days in Vancouver when he succeeded Mark Crawford. You talked about him succeeding John Tortorella in New York with the Rangers. Crawford back in that time was another John Tortorella type. And again, John Tortorella's kind of evolved. So he's no longer the bite your head off kind of guy that he used to be, or at least it doesn't seem that way with his Columbus Blue Jackets as they're up 3-0 on the President's Trophy winning Tampa Bay Lightning. There's no reason to be. But it'll be interesting to see what Vigneault does here and how he interacts with those players and what that roster ends up looking like. Because even if there wasn't a coaching change, and this is a roster where the core is mostly together. Wayne Simmons got traded at the deadline, but other than that, everybody's still here. And they haven't won a playoff series since 2012. You go through how many coaches in that time, it's obviously not the coaching that's the problem here.
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, and you think about, and this is something we talked about earlier, when you get deeper into the comments that were in your article about flying the zone before they have possession of the puck, not getting in shooter lanes, turning pucks over in the neutral zone, so on and so forth. We read it earlier. There seem to be certain players that come to mind when you have a young roster who they're going to look to veterans to establish good habits like that and come ready to play. And both of those things were lacking, and certain players come to mind as players that maybe the Flyers would look to move to maybe not only fit the style, but remove that stigma in the room that certain things are no longer acceptable.
Something to that, but you can't operate your off season by identifying what you want to subtract. I think, like, if you're talking about, like, when you mention shooting the zone, the player I think goes offsides the most is probably Travis Konecny, but that's just a guy that plays with speed. Just because of that, I don't think he's a guy that you're going to look to move. I think that there hasn't been a whole lot of growth in his game without the puck over the last couple of years. So, I mean, everybody has a price, right? So if you got offered something, maybe you'd look to do that. But I think that no matter what team you're managing, you have to look at what you want to add, not what you want to subtract. Because this isn't like a toxic situation where the room is kind of cut in half and you need to get the bad eggs out. I don't think there are bad eggs here. I think it's more so about, like you mentioned, those habits, and they're saying that they need somebody who can change those habits, not let's remove all those players from the roster that have those habits.
No, I do think there's a veteran or two that maybe it needs a change. I'll go out on a limb. I don't want to put you on a spot, but Jake Voracek has had a declining shot ratio, what they call Corsi for percentage, 5 years in a row. And he's at an age where he may begin leaving his prime. And I'm just thinking that he is someone who does often play recklessly, make passes he shouldn't make, maybe not as conscious about time, play, score. So, maybe that's fanciful on my part. I'm not trying to pick out one guy and just, make him the culprit. I'm just thinking that, again, habits of mindset, maybe there needs to be a change there. But
he turns 30, I believe, in August. I don't know about going on the back nine of his career by any stretch. I mean, Claude Giroux is a year and a half older, and he's still looking very much like he's in his prime. So I don't know about that so much. I do agree he makes some really risky passes sometimes, but there is a payoff too. If you're looking at certain statistics, I mean, you can make the numbers say anything really,
sure,
depending on what stat you're looking for. I do agree that he can be a risky player for sure, but I think that the payoff is there enough where I don't think he's a high risk to be moved. And the other reason why I don't think he's a high risk to be moved is he may not have a no trade clause, but that contract in itself is a no trade clause. I don't think there are going to be many teams lining up to take Jake Voracek at $8.25 million. Would teams like Jake Voracek? Absolutely. But I think that in a salary cap world and at that price, that's probably a little steep. So for that reason, I wouldn't get too worked up over thinking that he might leave.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough. And on the positive side, like you said with numbers, his possession quality is still pretty good. So it's not all negative. Again, I didn't want to appear to be dumping on the player. But moving on, Chuck Fletcher talked about how they appear to be committed to keeping Claude Giroux at wing. And that's the player's preference. And having doubts somewhat about Nolan Patrick being ready for a second-line center role. Looking at that, he appears to be focusing in on a second-line center, a veteran top four D-man, maybe one or two good two-way players, and some compliments to Carter Hart.
Those are all things on a shopping list, and I tried to kind of ask Fletcher yesterday, based on his conversations with Alain Vigneault, what other tools did Vigneault say, here's what I need to make this work? And he didn't really get very specific about that, but he kind of referred back to those comments and the items that you mentioned there. And I think that is a big need because whether Patrick can be a number two center in this league, I'm still a little unsure, but you can't bank on it. I think that they would be better off. I mean, especially with the guy who's still in his entry-level deal and he's not going to break the bank for you anytime soon. You can go out and spend at that position and still have some cost certainty with Patrick for another year. And then unless he really blows up and has a monstrous year, you got to figure that his next contract won't be at a huge number, at least, not with even one really good season in it. So I think that's definitely a need. And man, it was obvious that they needed a veteran defenseman and a top minutes eater. Provorov is their number one defenseman. He didn't have a very good year. Travis Sanheim was admirable. He played okay. I think he's going to be a really good player in this league, but I think that they need to find a better partner for Provorov. And they know now that Sanheim can do some of those things, but I don't know that I have a list. There are a couple players that would probably fit in real nicely here. But that's going to have to come via trade. And I'm not sure, who exactly would be available and who wouldn't be. The one name that I'm kind of intrigued about is Jared Spurgeon, a guy who is from the Minnesota Wild, Chuck Fletcher's old team, a right-handed defenseman. Matt Dumba's on their top pair, so I wouldn't say they could afford to lose Spurgeon, but he's a right-handed guy on their second pair where it might not break the team if if he were to move elsewhere, and that's a team that's in a really rough situation anyway. So if they can get a good enough package for him, maybe they would listen. But that's a guy who I think could be a really good fit with Provorov there. And in terms of centers, that'll be interesting to see. I think there's a little bit more in the free agent market there. A lot of people have mentioned Brock Nelson from the New York Islanders. That one will be a little bit more interesting to see, and there may be a little bit more wiggle room for Patrick to kind of take that job back next year if he proves he can handle it. But I don't think they want to start the season that way.
No, not at all. I was just thinking of defensemen. Maybe another name that could come up would be Jacob Trouba. He's had a strange relationship, but contractually with Winnipeg, and him coming up on an RFA year, this could be the year that they move on from him, and especially considering some of the salary crunch that they are under.
There's been so much talk this season, not just the Flyers, but league-wide, about restricted free agents and it being the summer of the offer sheet. But I think that's a scenario, as you mentioned, it's been complicated for Trouba and the Winnipeg Jets, and that might be a situation where you could pull a trade-off at the draft and get his rights, and they would be amicable to that instead of going the offer sheet route, and then the other team might match, and then you could lose draft picks if they don't match. And I think that might be a trade scenario, even though he's a pending free agent. But that's certainly one that I know for the last couple of years in Winnipeg, they've been thinking, yeah, this guy's probably not going to be here after this contract. So, yeah, I definitely think that's another name that could be a potential ad for the Flyers. He's a little bit younger, but he's got some experience in the league. I mean, I guess it depends on how you view Shane Gostisbehere, because I think they're the same age and have the same amount of experience in the league. So if some people still have Gostisbehere as a young guy in this team, and he's, I think, 25 years old. So by hockey years, he is kind of young. But in terms of the stuff that he's seen in the league, I mean, he's had a few games under his belt. He's got some playoffs under his belt. So certainly there's some experience that way.
Yeah, there's no question. And you mentioned it earlier about the minute munching aspect. I think one of the big weaknesses of the team, besides relying too much on Ivan Provorov for the toughest minutes, the PK, defending a lead at the end of the game, hard minutes. And one of the things about Trouba is that, unlike Gostisbehere, he is out there on the PK. He is out there against the toughest competition. But also the reliance on Giroux and Couturier for those situations, and having more two-way players throughout the lineup in general is probably something Chuck Fletcher is looking for.
You talked about Giroux being a wing. That's partially to elongate his career. Mm-hmm. I think he's going to get worn down a lot more if he's playing in the middle. And that also goes for him playing in the penalty kill. The Flyers don't really want to do that, but they had to do that quite a bit this season when their penalty kill was, 68%, something really atrocious like that. Yeah. And they were trying to get out of the basement. And that's one of the moves that they made. Now, I don't know that that'll ever happen with a guy like Couturier, because he's so strong defensively that you're hurting your team if you don't have him out there. But I agree that they need somebody to come in to kind of help take the burden off at least Claude Giroux in terms of forwards up there. And it'll be interesting to see how the rest of it plays out, because when Corbin Knight was healthy and in the NHL, he was a guy they relied on in the penalty kill. Michael Raffl was kind of in and out. He's obviously been re-signed, so he'll be back next year. The options, and we'll see what Alain Vigneault thinks and who his assistant coach is that will be running that facet of the game. There will be a lot of input there as well. You might see wholesale changes. I mean, I remember going into last season, we were talking about Travis Konechny potentially being part of the penalty kill, and Dave Haxtell saying, yeah, we're going to try him out there. And that was a very short-lived experiment. I don't even think it made it out of preseason games. But you never know. They may have some guys on the current roster that haven't been in that role before that they might try out there.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at it, a guy like Jonas Donskoy from San Jose, maybe that's a guy they could pick up as the Sharks have their own contractual challenges, and I'm looking for a lot of changes like that. But if I could just circle back to the RFAs, One of the other players I've heard through the grapevine that the Flyers admire, that they could kind of go at it, a quote, offer sheet, but not really an offer sheet, but maybe talk to Toronto about Kasperi Kapanen, as they have their challenges in Toronto with contracts. And this is a way that Flyers can really fill in their lineup, get more speed, and get younger and faster.
Talking about Toronto and RFAs, I think they like Mitch Marner more than they like Kasperi Kapanen now. Marner's probably more important, definitely more important to the Maple Leafs than Kapanen. But just seeing that number situation there, there's a lot of confidence in Toronto that deal will get done. But outside of the city, I think there's a lot of people saying, I just don't know how those numbers work, how they could pull that off. Now, certainly the Flyers wouldn't be alone if there was interest in offer sheets for Mitch Marner. And I can't really remember a scenario in which there were multiple teams offering offer sheets to a player. I don't know exactly off the top of my head how that would work, but I guess the player would have to, make a choice at that point. If he's got multiple suitors, that he would sign one place as opposed to another. It's not like you can sign multiple at one time. So there would certainly be some competition if it got to that point. But I think Marner would be the guy that the Flyers are looking at ahead of Kapanen.
Well, yeah, there's no question. The only thing with Marner is that if John Tavares was in his pajamas as a Maple Leaf, I think that Mitch Marner is even more committed, whatever you could be. I think he's got tattoos on his body that say Toronto Maple Leafs. He was Toronto born and bred, and he's with his hometown team. So I don't know if he'd actually sign an offer sheet, but yeah, I hear you. Marner might be as good as Matthews when it's all said and done. He's an amazing player. I just wanted to circle back to the hiring of Alain Vigneault, and I'm just wondering, when you look at the Flyers and their relevance in the league being one thing, but also looking at it from the Comcast perspective, the Flyers have kind of sunk like a rock to the bottom of the top major four. And I'm wondering if that played a role in the pressure to bear to get a big name like Vigneault, like you were referring to earlier, and whether that will spur him on even more from the management perspective to make a splash and make the Flyers fun and important again.
Certainly the mandate from the top when Ron Hextall was fired. And I remember there were a few reporters that were sitting in a boardroom with Dave Scott. And he was asked about that the Flyers are a distant fourth among the four pro teams. But he really seemed to see the most competition being in season. And the other tenant of Wells Fargo Center, the 76ers. And the Sixers at the time, I think, had just gotten Jimmy Butler. And he essentially said, we need to go find our Jimmy Butler. So it's, yes, 100%. It's not just a coach. They are going to be, pulling out the paychecks, the wallet to pay more people that are going to be on the ice and not just behind the bench. How many of those guys there are? I don't think it's a particularly strong free agent class. Obviously, they don't need a goalie. There's not much on defense. Erik Karlsson, I don't know where he's going to land, but I don't see Philadelphia as being a fit.
Right.
I guess I could be wrong, but I just don't think that's going to end up being a fit. So outside of that, I'm not sure. It's a bad summer to want to spend, I guess is what I'm getting at. The biggest name out there offensively is probably Artemi Panarin. And after Joel Quenneville took the job with the Florida Panthers, everybody seems to think that Panarin's going there. I know the Flyers will try. I've heard that they definitely want to make that push and offer something to Panarin and try and get him in here if they could. I know it was reported that last year at the draft, that was the trade that everybody didn't know what Ron Hextall was talking about when he said there was a deal that we almost made at the draft, but we couldn't make it. And apparently that was the deal. It was for Artemi Panarin. So
wow.
The Flyers have had eyes for him back then and still do. They'll try, but if you strike out there, then what? I think that like I said, it's a bad summer to have a full wallet and be, maybe an itchy trigger finger, and there's really not much to spend on. I think if this team wants to get markedly better with big name players, it's going to have to be by trades.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it seems like, unless you consider Kevin Hayes a big name. It might be a nice ad. I don't know if he's going to be the kind of splash that the Flyer fans are looking for. So, yeah, I could definitely see that.
This is about Kevin Hayes. I mean, he hasn't had a great playoffs, but the only day when players really want to talk to reporters is the day of the trade deadline, because they're out on the ice practicing, and then they come off the ice and they want to know what you've heard, what you've seen on Twitter, what deals have been done, because they haven't seen TSN or Sportsnet in the last hour or so. And that was the trade when the Flyers had come off the ice. It was probably the biggest at that point on trade deadline day. And the guys that had asked me what's going on, what moves have been made, and I said, well, Kevin Hayes has gone to Winnipeg. They said, man, he's a really good player. Like, when he was with the Rangers, they said he was really hard to play against. So he may not be having a great postseason, but certainly has the respect of the guys in there and a reputation in the league where, I mean, he's a big boy. I think he's 6'5", 6'6".
Yeah.
Having those big bodies down the middle of the ice. I don't know what the price tag would be on him, but that would be a potential fit for the Flyers if they could work something out.
Sure. Yeah. Look at that. Metrics with him, if you're into the analytics, are pretty impressive. 55-point guy, no question. Dave, just a couple more. Wanted to know if you had heard or anybody had asked Chuck about some of the comments he made speaking with Russ Cohen and Jason Martinez about not just wanting one goaltender, veteran goaltender backup, Carter Hart, but getting two, maybe somebody who would be in the AHL with Felix Sandstrom, and then, of course, an Elliott or more than likely a Talbot behind Carter Hart. Any comments, or have you heard anything like that?
I haven't heard that interview yet, but he had mentioned at times this season about needing multiple goalies, and that didn't compute for me because, like you mentioned, Sandstrom, well, he played a game at the end of the Phantom season there, but he'll be there. Alex Lyon's still got another year under contract. So you would think that those would be two AHL guys there. And then you figure Carter Hart and somebody else. And like you said, Talbot is probably the leader in the clubhouse right now. And I think his stock probably even went up with Alain Vigneault coming back because they were with the Rangers together.
Right.
So I'm not sure why you need that fifth goaltender unless you're just still having nightmares about 8 goalies in one season. And that may be the case. But there is such a thing as too many cooks in the kitchen too, and I think that once you get into that scenario, you could be getting there if you add a fifth goalie. I mean, it was really playing with fire, and probably Ron Hextall's most obvious failure in the last year was starting the season with a guy coming off injury and surgery in Brian Elliott and Michael Neuwirth, who's just perpetually hurt. So that was just a bad scenario waiting to happen. But I think that once you get to 5 goalies, it's like, what do you do with that?
Yeah, I know. Maybe they were thinking of moving on from Alex Lyon, and then you throw Kirill Ustimenko into the bargain in the ECHL. So, yeah, there's a lot going on there. The Flyers fell back one spot to number 11 for this year's upcoming amateur draft. But maybe more to the point, the Devils and Rangers are going to go 1-2 ostensibly for Jack Hughes and Capo Kakko. I guess this adds to their sense of urgency or willingness to take a big risk to obtain high-level talent, because in a couple years, these should be close to elite players.
I agree completely. What a bad night that is, where everybody else in the division is in the playoffs, and the other two teams who aren't moved up to 1 and 2 in the draft lottery. There's not a much worse formula for a night for the Flyers, who moved back a spot. I think that those will be two very good players, Hughes and Capo. What the Flyers end up doing with that pick, I don't know. I know Chuck Fletcher said that the first half of the first round, he thinks there's a really good premium on it. There's probably, obviously there's some drop off after those first 2 players, I think, and then probably another drop off somewhere around the 14-15 neighborhood.
Right.
Do the Flyers keep that pick? Do they, move that pick to try and get one of those players that you're talking about that would move the needle and make them markedly better? That's certainly something to consider as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's still a lot of talent in the range that they'll be drafting, and those names will become more familiar as we get closer to the draft, and we'll certainly be covering that. We'll be looking for your articles in that regard on the Courier Post of South Jersey. And Dave, any other impressions or comments about what went down this season or what you've seen so far in your exit interviews, general impressions?
Probably the craziest season. I mean, this is my 9th season covering the team. By far the strangest, between the 8 goalies, between the coach firing, between the general manager firing, and almost getting Quenneville, not quite getting him. Oh, by the way, there was a player who was wanted in a foreign country for his partner cocaine ring the whole time, and that barely got talked about. I mean, it was just bizarre. Just bizarre. And the players, I mean, all the way through said that. And a lot of them in the exit interview said, that period of time, that December, or I guess late November, was, started when Hextall was fired, because nobody really saw that coming. Said that they were happy that they kind of kept things together in the locker room, because that could have been a real easy way to go completely off the rails. And that was kind of when their season actually started turning the corner and going in a more positive direction for them. So the fact that they were able to keep it together is certainly something that they valued. But I'm kind of still marveling at all that we saw with how many goalies and general managers and coaches. And it was a lot to take in. Very strange year.
Yeah, no question. Then you add to that down 2-0 in 32 out of 82 games. And, we have a lot to look forward to in terms of improvement next year. Dave, thanks so much for coming back on the O&B Puckcast and braving some of the audio challenges we have. Where can people find you on Twitter?
D. Isaac on Twitter.
Okay. At Dave G. Isaac on Twitter, in case that didn't come over. Dave, thanks again. Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do this after what will be a busy off-season. Take care now. All right, so sorry for the audio difficulties. I'm back with Chef and Dan, and not a lot surprising there, gentlemen. What can you make of my conversation with Dave, and some things you could pull out of that?
I guess the biggest discrepancy would be like keeping Voracek.
Yeah, I'm determined to just move on, because I think it would make a really big impact on the team if they. So look, I don't want to just give them away, but
no. I'm not saying give them away. I'm just thinking, we earlier in the show we had talked about how something has to give, a facelift on his team when, or even if it's just, hell, I've done it. I've gone into kitchens as a chef, and I've walked in and I've sat there and went, all right, who's going to be the first wise guy I got to axe? And as soon as you find out who that is, or somebody who's not a team player, or someone, you have to make an example at that point. At that point, new broom sweeps clean type thing. And I think that he has to be somebody that takes the heat or takes the round for the team to get better. I mean, you have to make somebody – it has to be an example. It has to be I don't want to say mercy killing, but you have to. You have to do something. Something needs to change on the team. And if he has to be the guy, I think he's the example you set. Look, if they're willing to get rid of the highest paid guy on this team, and he's locked up for 4 more years, and they're willing to eat some of his salary to get rid of him, oh, man, what are they going to do to me? Or where does that leave me? They need to get back into the culture of playing the whole damn game. This team didn't play the whole damn game. You mentioned at the beginning, how many times did they start 0-2? 32, right?
Yeah, out of 82, right.
Out of 82. that's not, to me, that's not playing the whole game. I mean, before it was, they fizzled out. I was still, well, when we were having the difficulties, I was telling Dan, at the beginning of the process, when Hextall took over, the team was fizzling out during games. Conditioning wasn't there or something. They couldn't finish games. Now it was, slowly transitioned to, we can't start games. So I think that somebody needs, when he needs to come in here, he needs to lay down the hammer. He needs to whack somebody just for the simple fact of making a point. And whether I would do it if it was Giroux that talked back. I'm like, boom, you're going down to the Phantoms. At least that, bang. Or something along those lines. You could start down there and think about what you did. Our parents did it to us. I had to go stand in the corner for I don't know how long when I was a kid, just because I wouldn't eat my vegetables or whatever. But
it didn't work, did it?
Oh, I love vegetables.
Oh,
now.
Okay. Oh, okay. No,
it's a little too late.
Yeah. Well, no, really, I mean, Voracek, I mean, obviously with Giroux's got no move clause, that would be silly, and he's not a problem. But yeah, Voracek's got another 5 years at 8.25. So, like Dave was saying, that's definitely a hindrance there. And I don't know. He thinks that Vigneault can make an impression on Voracek. So we'll have to see. So really interesting coming up. The Flyers are set, Dan, and I guess within the next few weeks, things are going to get a little quiet. And tell us, Dan, what you're going to be discussing on Brotherly Pod and how people can contact you as we wrap things up today.
Well, I will be back tomorrow night with the Angry Negative Show with Angry Jim. We will be weighing in on the new coach, Alain Vigneault. We'll be talking about the playoffs. I'm sure there will be a good old-fashioned rant about Flyers Twitter in there somewhere. And some announcements to come on that show. Look for some special announcements personally in the next Wednesday, the 24th. I will be, my future will be talked about on Twitter. So I will, all kinds of fun stuff. That's at Dan the Flyer Fan, at Brotherly Puck, and at Brotherly_pod.
Yeah, I guess that begs the question, will there be visitation rights?
Maybe.
Yeah. Just, your future and all that. But, Chef, if people want to follow you on Twitter, how can they do that?
Chef to the left B at twitter.com. And also, you can come in the Steam Pub at 606 2nd Street Pike in Southampton, PA. You mention my name, I'll come out, give you a little discount or whatever if I'm there, if I'm happy to be working at night. So, all good.
Good, cool. And I can be followed, Isaiah, ISAIAH _520 at Isaiah _520 on Twitter. And you can follow the O&B Puckcast at O&B Puck at O&B Puck. And remember, this is important if you would, as we coming close to wrapping up another season, at least until, I guess our next show will be sometime in May. If you could rate and subscribe the O&B Puckcast on one of the formats. It would be great if you could do it on iTunes. That's the big kahuna. But also if you prefer SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play. We also have a YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and check out the O&B Puckcast and with the symbol for and you'll get to us. We're also on the website of at Philly Sports Network.com, PhillySportsNetwork.com. Great content there, our partners, and Wildfire Radio. We're regular on the stream on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock. Go to Wildfire Radio, hit the drop-down menu, check out the O&B Puckcast there. We really appreciate that. And with that, maybe we'll be back in about 3 weeks or so, pending some other Flyers news. The coaches will be hired. Maybe there'll be some assistant coaches that we have not been happy with that will no longer be with the team. We'll have to see how that works out. But until then, who's that?
Happy.
Yeah. You're very happy. I understand. Yeah. Well, you're feeling better. That's okay. No, it's all right. But until next time, let's go Flyers, and everybody take care.